Welcome to the last of this academic year's In Good Faith evenings. I'm Sheila McLaughlin. If there's anyone here who doesn't know me, I think there might be because we have a few new people. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this evening for our In Good Faith session. How many of you who are here this evening are here for the first time? Oh, that's great. Wonderful. So a special welcome to all of you and deep appreciation to those of you who've been coming for, some of you from the beginning, which is now about 6 years, I think, that we've been doing this. So we're delighted to have you and looking forward to our evening. As most of you know, as I just said, we've been at this for quite a while, and we really believe in the Bernardine Center and here at CTU that this initiative is critically important in building lasting relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, between people of different faiths. Relationships that have been and continue to be fostered and strengthened by our dialogue. The In Good Faith program has become a mainstay for the Bernardine Center, something that's really important for our work. And I think through the efforts of all of us here, as well as others who've participated over the years, we really do understand one another and care for one another at a deeper level. And I believe that all that we do together, and I think all of us who've been involved in the dialogue believe that each of us and all of us become more effective leaders for our particular communities and across our communities as well. So our topic this evening is race, racism, and anti-racism, critical perspectives from our religious traditions. As in all of our other evenings, each panelist will have 20 minutes to present their point of view on the topic. I say this realizing that it's absolutely impossible to cover this or any of our topics in this short of a time. But hopefully, what the speakers have to say encourages us to work with that information and engage in a substantial dialogue and a substantial conversation about what we've heard. We have 3 outstanding speakers for this evening, and I'm pleased to introduce them to you. The first is Rabbi Michael Siegel, who is the senior rabbi at Anshe Emet Synagogue, and he holds the Norman Asher Rabbinic Chair. Rabbi Siegel is a graduate of Hiram College. He was ordained in 1982 by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he received his Master of Hebrew Letters. He came to Anshe Emet in 1982 as the assistant rabbi and was named senior rabbi in 1990. Rabbi Siegel is a dedicated leader in the Jewish community, both locally and nationally. He serves on the Executive Council of the Rabbinical Assembly of America, the Jewish Theological Seminary's Chancellor's Rabbinic Cabinet, and the Executive Board of Mason. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. I'm sorry. Mason, okay, thank you. A Jewish Resource to Hunger. Rabbi Siegel is also a board member of the Jewish United Fund of Metropolitan Chicago, on the advisory board of the DePaul University College of Law, Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies, a past president of the Chicago Board of Rabbis, an active leader in the Florence J. Heller Jewish Community Center. So welcome, Rabbi Siegel. Our second speaker is Sister Anita Baird. Sister Anita is the founding director of the Archdiocesan Office for Racial Justice, which was established by Cardinal Francis George July 1st, 2000. The office is a direct outgrowth from the Archdiocese of Chicago's Task Force on Racism, which came about as a response to the beating of Leonard Clark in 1997. Probably many of you remember that. The core mission of the office is to address the sin of racism by providing parishes and schools with the tools to initiate and enhance their efforts to combat racism. She is a member of the religious congregation, the Society of the Daughters of the Heart of Mary. Welcome, Sister Anita. Professor Aminah McCloud is Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Islamic World Studies, the Islamic World Studies program at DePaul University. Her areas of expertise include Islam in America, Muslim women, Islamic studies and history, geography, politics, religion, and philosophy of Islam. She is the author and co-author of several books, including African American Islam, Questions of Faith, Transnational Muslims in American Society, and An Introduction to Islam in the 21st Century. Professor McCloud is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture and a member of the Board of Advisors of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. So I invite the panelists to come forward.
Good evening, everyone. I'll look at my watch now. It was wonderful to see some of you at Anshe Emet this past weekend. We had a remarkable concert where we celebrated the musical traditions of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. To be at a concert where there were an Islamic children's choir, a Greek Orthodox choir, an African American choir, was something that we won't soon forget. Our hope is that we will be able to go from strength to strength and build on our joint traditions and raise our voices together. In January of 1963, the Conference on Religion and Race took place here in the city of Chicago. It was a remarkable gathering, bold in design. It was held at a time when there was a great amount of tension in this country regarding civil rights and the bill that was struggling through Congress. Chicago was an even more divided city then than it is now, if you can imagine that. It took courage to hold such a program here in Chicago. One of the more noteworthy aspects of the conference was that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel met there for the first time. That meeting changed history. Their meeting ultimately changed each man profoundly. It would be difficult to find two people from more different backgrounds. Heschel, part of a Hasidic dynasty, saved from the fires of the Holocaust, and Reverend King, the son of a black preacher from the American South. Both impacted each other profoundly. Heschel got King involved in the Vietnam War, in the protest movement. And Reverend King inspired Rabbi Heschel to walk with him in Selma. And when Rabbi Heschel returned, he famously said, "When I walked in Selma, my feet were praying." What I propose to do this evening is to examine Rabbi Heschel's speech at this conference, to offer us insight into the Jewish approach to race and racism and anti-racism, but also to have the opportunity to discuss the importance of the prophetic voice. And this is appropriate on this, the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and this year being the 40th yahrzeit, the 40th anniversary of the death of Rabbi Heschel. So this is how Abraham Joshua Heschel began his talk that day. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. The outcome of that summit meeting has yet to come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. Let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness. In the words of William Lloyd Garrison, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject of slavery, I do not wish to think, to speak, or to write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Religion and race. How can the two be uttered together? To act in the spirit of religion is to unite what lies apart, to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. To act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of living humanity. Is this the way to honor a father? To torture his child? How can we hear the word race and feel no self-reproach? Heschel's speech was powerful. It was evocative, and it was effective, no question. But how accurate was Rabbi Heschel in capturing the Torah's approach to the issue of race and subjugation? True, the Torah speaks at length of the ger, of the stranger. According to the Torah, the God of Israel is a God who has a deep and abiding concern for those who are mistreated in society. Consider the case of Hagar, a woman whose name literally means the stranger. And she was that, the ultimate stranger. She is caught between Abraham and Sarah and God's promise and their desire for a child. Hagar is so mistreated by Sarah physically and so abandoned by Abraham's ambivalence that she is forced to flee. What is not generally noted is the covenant between the pieces, Bein HaPtarim, is recorded directly before the introduction of Hagar in the Torah. And that covenant ends with these ominous words. Know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. The fact that Hagar, the stranger, is an Egyptian seems to suggest that there is a connection between the story of Hagar, between the mistreatment of the ger, the stranger, and the years of slavery for the descendants of Abraham and Sarah in her home country. The God of Israel, we learn, is concerned with the plight of the ger, the stranger, and demands of the descendants of Abraham and Sarah that they do likewise. 36 times in the Torah is the word ger used. We are admonished over and over and over again to remember that we were strangers in a strange land. But let me ask you this. Does the same hold true in the Torah for slavery? And here we must answer no. The issue in the book of Exodus revolves around Moses and Pharaoh, and the question is, who is God? Is it Pharaoh or is it the creator of the heavens and the earth? I'm sorry to say that the issue in the book of Exodus is not slavery. That is why Moses' initial request of Pharaoh is that the people be allowed 3 days to worship their God in the wilderness and return. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." They answered, "The God of the Hebrews has manifested himself to us. Let us go, we pray, a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God." The issue of Exodus is not, as Heschel would suggest, opening Pharaoh's eyes to the horrors of slavery, but rather opening Pharaoh's eyes to the question of who is God. That is why the plagues are an uncreation, a display of God's power as the creator of heaven and earth. That is why the 9th plague is that of darkness, to upend the first thing that was created, namely or light. This explains God's words to Moses in Exodus 14. "And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so that they may go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots and his horsemen. Let the Egyptians know that I am the Lord, when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." If the issue was slavery, then we might have expected that the portion of Mishpatim, the detailed law code following the giving of the 10 Commandments, would have begun with the laws prohibiting slavery. And it does just the opposite. It begins with the laws for the Israelite slave, and virtually nothing is said of the enslavement of the non-Israelite. So how then do we explain Rabbi Heschel's beginning, this conversation between Moses and Pharaoh about the evils of slavery? Is it a modern form of midrash? Is it artifice? No, I suggest to you that Abraham Joshua Heschel was speaking with a prophetic voice. In 1962, Heschel published his magnificent book, The Prophets. What I want to suggest this evening is that Rabbi Heschel used his understanding of the prophet as the lens with which to view the modern day. He, in his own unique way, redefined the Jewish approach to race in this speech through the understanding of the prophet and its application for the modern day. For the prophet, according to Heschel, the beginning of the conversation is awareness of God and awareness of God's concern for humanity. We know from the Chicago speech and many others that the prophet demonstrated that man is not alone, that God is in search of man, so that we can help make God's world more compassionate and just. For the prophet, our partnership is with God. The Brit is not about ritual, but about societal transformation to right the wrongs of society in every age. The biblical prophets intuited God's will and translated it into imperatives in historical situations. For Isaiah, it might have been the Assyrians and their conquest of the Middle East. For Ezekiel, the Babylonians in giving hope to the Jews of his age as they sat by the rivers of Babylon. For Heschel, the historical issues that the prophets of our day were concerned with were the civil rights struggle and the Vietnam War. The Torah's view on slavery no longer applied for Heschel. Here it is important to point out that for the Jew, as made plain by the prophets, there is a historical continuum, an evolving revelation. The views of the Torah on a given issue were open to radical reinterpretation. Read Isaiah on sacrifice and see how different his approach is than the book of Leviticus. Or read the book of Jonah and its understanding of God's concern for the other nations of the world, and you'll see a powerful evolution of ideas first presented in the Torah. One of the major ideas Heschel brings forth in the prophets is the concept of divine pathos. The God of Israel is the antithesis of the unmoved mover. The God of Israel is a God that feels the pain of the stranger and responds with anger and rage at a society which creates such injustice. The prophet experiences God's pain, God's sympathy for the divine pathos. The prophet feels what God feels. Just as parents cannot tolerate the suffering of their children or easily look on stoically as their neighbor's children suffer, the parent of us all cannot remain indifferent to our suffering. The prophet bore the full brunt of that recognition and cried out in God's name. So listen to Heschel's words. There is an evil which most of us condone and are even guilty of, indifference to evil. We remain neutral and partial and not easily moved by the wrongs done unto other people. Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It is more universal, more contagious, more dangerous, a silent justification. It makes possible an evil erupting as an exception, becoming the rule and being in turn accepted. The prophet's great contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. One may be decent and sinister, pious and sinful. The prophet is a person who suffers the harms done to others. Wherever a crime is committed, it is as if the prophet were the victim and the prey. The prophet's angry words cry, the wrath of God is a lamentation. All prophecy is one great exclamation. God is not indifferent to evil. He is always concerned. He is personally affected by what man does to man. He is a God of pathos. Heschel was speaking in 1963 as a modern prophet, and that prophetic voice made all the difference. The Jewish community did not need Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel to tell them that the treatment of African Americans threatened the democracy of this great nation. They already knew that and were amongst the founders and developers of the NAACP. The Jewish community did not need Heschel to tell them that educational discrimination would only perpetuate the inequality of society. In 1917, Julius Rosenwald, the heir of the Sears Roebuck Empire, set up the Julius Rosenwald Fund, a Chicago-based philanthropic foundation. At the program's conclusion in 1932, it had produced 4,977 new schools, 217 teachers' homes, and 163 shop buildings constructed at a total cost, and this is in 1932, of $28,408,000 to serve 663,000 students in 883 counties of 15 states, the majority of these built in the South. There were Jews who were very involved in the creation of the Civil Rights Act. What drove them was a tradition that warned against the oppression of the stranger. What drove them was the notion that human beings are all created in God's image. What compelled them to act was a Torah that commanded them to love their neighbors as themselves. We didn't need Heschel to teach that lesson, but what was needed was the prophetic perspective and the prophetic voice to move us forward at this most difficult juncture, to say that it is hard, it is difficult, but we cannot accept the status quo. God is urging us, and we must feel the pain of God, the frustration of God, the anger of God, as people of color, people across the spectrum of society are subjugated and oppressed. And for the Jewish community, Heschel provided that just as Dr. King did for the African American community. Today, in a world of apathy and individualism, that prophetic voice is needed now more than ever. Permit me to end with Heschel's concluding words at that conference on race and religion. Let us not forget the story of the sons of Jacob. Joseph, the dreamer of dreams, was sold into slavery by his own brothers. But at the end, it was Joseph who rose to be the savior of those who had sold him into slavery. Mankind lies groaning, afflicted by fear, frustration, and despair. Perhaps it is the will of God that among the Josephs of the future, there will be many who have once been enslaved and whose skin is dark. The great spiritual resources of the Negroes, their capacity for joy, their quiet nobility, their attachment to the Bible, their power of worship and enthusiasm may prove to be a blessing for all mankind. In the words of the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. He concluded, justice, people seem to agree is a principle, a norm, an ideal of the highest importance. We all insist that it ought to be, but it may not be. In the eyes of the prophets, justice is more than an idea or a norm. Justice is charged with the omnipotence of God. What ought to be, shall be. Friends, 51 years later today, we have an African American president. And approximately 12 to 13% of the American population is African American, but they make up 40% of the almost 2.1 million male inmates in jail or prison. In our country, families of all races make up 11.8% of those in poverty, but 24% of the black community. Heschel's speech of 1963 leaves us with a burning question in 2014, a question that needs to be answered by the three Abrahamic faiths. Beyond the ethical teachings of our faiths, beyond the teachings which we share to love our neighbors as ourselves, beyond our teachings to not oppress the stranger, we must ask, where is the prophetic voice today, summoning us to feel God's presence, experience God's pathos, and act on God's behalf? Thank you.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening and with this esteemed panel as we look at the question of race and anti-racism in the context of our faith traditions. And so I just want to address some points to you in three parts. First, how my faith tradition deals with the concept of race. As we know in the Abrahamic faith tradition, that God created humanity in God's image. He created us male and female, and God saw that God's creation was good. God intended that we live together in harmony and in love. In fact, the story is about relationship with God and God's people throughout history. In Matthew 22:34, when asked, which is the greatest commandment of the law, Jesus answered, after loving the Lord your God with all your heart, the second most important commandment is love your neighbor as you love yourself. The whole law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets depend on these two commandments. In other words, we cannot claim to love God without loving our neighbor. In Galatians 3:28, Jesus prays that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you. So also may they be one in us. In his pastoral letter on racism, Dwell in My Love, Cardinal Francis George writes that racism contradicts God's will for our salvation, and since racism is a failure to love our neighbor, only freedom from racism will enable us to be one with God and one another. The scriptures do not deal with race as we define and know it today. But throughout the scriptures, love, justice, repentance for sins against one's neighbor affirms our common brotherhood. Race as we know it today is a relatively modern social construct that was developed during the colonialization of the Americas to justify the genocide and enslavement of Native and African peoples, for the taking of the land and the idolatry of greed. The second point I want to address is, how does my tradition address the reality of racism? And I'm going to look particularly from the Catholic tradition. The Catholic Church in the United States has written very little on the subject of racism. Since 1954, the U.S. Bishops' Conference has issued only 3 statements on racial justice. In 1958, in 1968, and in 1979, when they wrote their pastoral letter, Brothers and Sisters to Us. It was in that document that they stated very clearly that racism is a sin. Most Catholics in the pews have never heard of these documents, and they certainly never received the attention or acclaim that the Bishop's Pastoral on Peace did in 1983. Not only within the Catholic community, but across all communities. Also during this time, the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in Rome wrote on the subject in 1988, "The Church and Racism Toward a More Fraternal Society." And in 2001, they issued the document, "Contribution to World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance." In 2002, the Conference of Catholic Bishops Ad Hoc Committee on Native American Catholics wrote a document, Native American Catholics at the Millennium. But not much was addressed in terms of the Church's role in the genocide of Native peoples in this land, the taking of their land, the taking of their cultures, the taking of their children. While the Church has long acknowledged racism as being intrinsically evil, only within the last 35 years has it begun to grapple with an understanding of racism as being more than racial prejudice. Defining racism as racial prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions, systems that produce, maintain, and distribute the resources, systems that determine who will have access and who will not. There have been a number of pastoral letters written by local bishops in their dioceses on the subject, but most deal with the subject as personal prejudice. Only 3 bishops, Cardinal George being one, Bishop Del Metchik of Gary, Indiana, and Archbishop Alfred Hughes of New Orleans, have addressed the systemic issues around race, along with Catholic Charities USA in their document published in 2009, poverty and racism, overlapping threats to the common good. Most church leaders and the faithful, however, continue to define racism as personal prejudice without seeing how they benefit from white privilege and power, consciously or unconsciously, nor how the systemic reality of racism continues to play out in most of our institutions: educational, health, judicial, and political, and the list can go on. For too long, we have simply looked at racism as my personal dislike of another. But we fail to see how complex race and racism is in our society today, much more complex than it was 50 years ago. Third, I want to speak just briefly about some of the resources for creating anti-racist institutions and movements. And they are few, because while we talk a good talk, we really have failed to walk the walk. Our institutions like the way they are. We are comfortable with them being the way they are. And we really do not want to be challenged. We will write all of the right things on paper. But when it comes to really changing an institution, when it comes to being accountable, particularly to communities of color and to the poor and to those who have been left out, we tend not to want to do the hard work. We tend not to have those people at the table, because those people will call us to honesty. And so at this moment in time, there are a few denominations and religious organizations that are actively engaged in anti-racism work and have been for the last 15 to 20 years, but just beginning. It is a difficult process, for we spent many years living in a society that was segregated by law, and few years living in a society where, at least on paper, it is against the law. And our churches, who really should be leading the way, all of our faith denominations and traditions who believe in the one God, we have been caught up in cultural racism in our society, in our institutions, in our houses of faith. We spend more time reflecting the larger society than reflecting God's vision of who He created us to be. In doing this work in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and I sadly have to say that it is only in the Archdiocese of Chicago that has an office dedicated to the work of addressing racism. No other archdiocese has such an office. We have worked closely with the Episcopal Church in the United States, with the Evangelical Lutherans, the Mennonites, the United Methodist Church, National Council of Churches, the Presbyterian Church, and the United Church of Christ, as well as Pax Christi USA, which is the Roman Catholic peace movement. And I am very proud to say that there are religious congregations of women who have anti-racism teams. Several are the Sisters of Providence in Terre Haute, the Sinsinawa Dominicans, and the Joliet Franciscans, to name a few. For the most part, we still continue to struggle within our faith tradition around the issue of immigration. Racism in this country is no longer black and white. It is much more complicated than that. There is a fear, even in the faith communities, of people of color seeking religious freedom, seeking a better way of life, seeking education for their children. Where do they fit in? How do we welcome them? Is there really a place for them at the table? There are two books that I would recommend to you on this subject. And one is Racial Justice and the Catholic Church by Brian Massengel, which was published in 2010. And another is Becoming an Anti-Racist Church, Journeying Towards Wholeness by Joseph Bart, that was published in 2011. I have a couple of handout resources that I have placed at the tables and would welcome you to please take them. One is called The Continuum of Going from Being a Segregated Church to being an anti-racist church that is not only transformed within itself, but has the power to transform society around it. Within the Archdiocese of Chicago, we have created a strategic plan of action for our churches and institutions, and that is to connect anti-racism to the church's spiritual foundations and social teachings, to understand racism as a systemic issue, to identify personal and systemic benefits for all of us to be transformed, to engage in anti-racist identity shaping processes within our institutions. It is required, mandated, that everyone who works in our in the archdiocesan offices, agencies, parishes go through some type of anti-racism training. And to make anti-racism initiatives part of our institutional culture. We have been at this now for about 12 years. We're just beginning. In conclusion, I would like to quote from Joseph Bart, who writes in his book, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. He says, racism is dying, but it is being kept alive on institutional life support systems. In other words, we are helping to keep it alive because we cannot imagine a world without racism in it. As people of faith, we're called to assist in bringing about the death of racism. We need to reclaim an anti-racist gospel and work together to shape an anti-racist church. With the death of racism, new life is possible, and the whole family of God can discover new freedom. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like, as others, to open with remarks with a thanks for the invitation from the Good Faith Committee. I've been here for a few years and learned a great deal. I haven't, however, been able to get all my students to come and join us, but I'll work on that for the next meeting. I had to say, when I saw the categories that were sent to us, I had a little trepidation. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be Black tonight or Muslim. So you're going to get a little bit of both. This is the kind of audience I haven't seen in a minute since we had the conversation on sex. So this is good. This is really good. Having been Muslim for a moment, 50 years worth of them, I've kind of seen things ebb and flow. But I have to admit, not having grown up in Chicago, but in the Midwest, Chicago has been a challenge. You hear tales of Chicago's racism. You come here and then you see them on the ground. I teach at DePaul, still, I don't know how long, the largest Catholic university in the country, and you see all kinds of efforts that you don't see in other spaces inside of Chicago. But also, during my first maybe 3 years at DePaul, we ran into an instance of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish presence that happened in Skokie, where some group of somebodies, had written all kinds of racial slurs on the side of a synagogue. So I was trying to get my students together, we need to go. And they were all looking at me like, we know you're Black, but have you lost your mind? We can't, what are we supposed to do? Well, you can be there to say something against it. But then I realized that along with the reputation that is Chicago, children have been fed what they've been fed since they were old enough to listen. For me, from the Muslim perspective, and I don't have a Christian or a Jewish one, it is an interesting proposition to ask traditions, which are at least a millennia old, to have something to say about a modern construct such as race. But having said that, it is clear that we all search our traditions for something profound and are clarifying to share, so we can then mute the subject. The Quran speaks of the deliberate creations of nations, languages, and tribes, a deliberate creation in a diversity of colors, awanakum, to come to know one another and compete in the performance of good deeds, as God defines good deeds, not as we often define them. In the worldview of the Quran, color is by design neither a punishment nor a curse. Difference by divine design has attracted people to Islam for centuries. Difference is celebrated most often on the tongues of Muslims with the use of the term ummah, the community of believers. God in the Quran certainly acknowledges differences in skin color as he created them, but does not assign any particular value to this difference. What is focused on is belief and action among the many tribes of God, which are bound together by belief in the one God and just action. There's a brief discussion in one place on the Arab tribes. The Quran says the Arabs of the desert are the worst in unbelief and hypocrisy, and most fitted to be in ignorance of the commands which Allah has sent down to his messenger. But God is all-knowing, all-wise. Scholars have interpreted this rebuke to cut short, so to speak, any tendency on the part of Arabs to assume that because their ethnic tribes were the first to hear this message in their language, that they are somehow superior to all the other tribes who come. Here again, there is no mention of race, nor is there a mention of any of the concepts which we know in the modern day of race. Skin color does not mean race back then, as many such African Americans have the same skin color as Arabs or South Asians. Anthropologists argue that race, although thought to have begun as a folk idea, took institutional forms in Europe and America at the beginning of the 18th century as a set of culturally created attitudes and beliefs about human group differences, and is epistemologically a uniquely European invention, spread with some reliance on particular biblical passages about blackness and a curse. I can't say I've read that passage, so I can't comment on it. Early Muslim scholars pick up the stories of the curses, however, on people whose skin color is black from the theological environment of Christians and Jews, and leave the worldview that the Quran sets forth behind. Arabs are put on a pedestal very early in Islamic history as superior, while blacks are to be tolerated as Muslims, but born to be enslaved. Muslim slavers, and there are loads of them, use tribal affiliation along with color as a basis for enslavement of other Muslims for centuries. One might want to ask, how could this be, since there is no scriptural support? One answer may simply lie in the fact that power has needs, and whoever won the battle saw enslavement and the selling of slaves as a right. Still, the modern-day concept of race was not present. This is evident in the fact that a group of Muslim slaves, the Mamluks, who were deployed as slave warriors in the 9th century, established dynasties of their own by the 13th century. Perhaps this is also one early piece of evidence of army takeovers in Muslim history. Colonial forces instilled European notions of race everywhere in the world. While all were occupied, those closer in skin color to white were assumed to be more malleable and able to be educated. For my readings, this started systematic racism in the Muslim world based on tribe and phenotype, though both were as difficult to rationally sustain as they are for those of us in the West. Today, with a wide knowledge, at least among the educated, that race is a European construct regarding theory, its definition now is a universal one, and it is pervasive, affecting every aspect of the lives of its victims. I must interject here that most recently, Muslims have become, in the US and Europe, acutely aware of the insidiousness of systematic racism, as it has focused on skin color, religion, and ethnicity. It is not that Muslims have not known the virtues and rewards of whiteness and the problems of blackness. They have not, as communities or as a religious body, considered the situation important enough to tackle until recently, when they began to be targeted religiously and then by ethnicity. Racism is largely a taboo topic outside of Islamophobia. There's an awareness that a claim to the lack of racism in the Quran, and thus in Islam, is playing dangerously in America, where people do read and do watch. And if one makes that claim, then everybody's watching to see what you do. This general awareness, however, has not led to a decrease in racism inside the Muslim community, but it has led to an increase in a cover called acts of charity, going to the food pantry, serving in a church's, not a Muslim, not a mosque kitchen, somebody else's kitchen, to pretend that you are one or in solidarity with the poor. It's still from the superior to the inferior. Many Muslim children are indoctrinated into the racist system by the acts of parents toward blacks and Latinos, and Arabs toward all others, and sometimes each other. And just as an anecdote, my husband and I were members of a book club. We, fortunately or unfortunately, were the only black members of the book club. But the kids had not been introduced to people of color. And we, in 2013, had the honor of witnessing a kid scream in terror at our presence. Those children had never met anybody outside of their own color group. So having us in their house spurned, as we were told later, nightmares, confusion, are they coming back? And for us was an embarrassment I haven't felt since, as a kid, I had to use fountains labeled colored, bathrooms labeled colored. You know, it's the same kind of revisiting that I did not expect inside of Muslim communities. Through several weeks ago, to show how insidious, but also how pervasive racism can be, we went to a fundraiser by one of the Muslim organizations. The speakers, rare occasion, as I was telling her, it's a rare occasion that there are two black women anywhere, speaking on anything. And at this fundraiser, the moderator was African-American Muslim woman. The Muslim scholar was an African-American Muslim male. The other scholar was white, skin color only, Muslim imam. When it came time for them to speak, the majority immigrant audience left. I have never, ever seen this happen before, as the speakers are usually immigrants, flown in, found, brought out of closets, wherever. But in this instance, where you had African American scholars holding the day and talking about things like we're talking about this evening, everybody left. In Black and Latino communities, racism amongst Muslims is a frequent topic. Many in these communities, even third and fourth generations, feel that the discussion is important and urgent in racist America. They are aware of the fact that many Muslim Americans of immigrant descent claim not to see racism, but are convinced that they are just being racist. At this moment in time, I don't know what kind of institution would be successful. Muslims do not come together in that way. There's no organizing body. And if you tried to have a conference on racism, no one would come except the victims. I don't know, as a graduate of Gestalt and what was the other one, Life Springs and 49 other groups back in the 60s and 70s, which worked to try to get individuals to rid themselves of their own bigotry, personal, and back then it was assumed or presumed that blacks had some bigotry too. Not that the victim always gets off the hook. Since then, I have seen in Islam, and back then, Muslims did join those groups. With the influx of Muslims after the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s, it was no longer necessary. Groups now organize around Islamophobia. Don't know what we could do there. One day I went to class, and at least 2 of my black students are here, one right there and one over there, and decided that I was purple. And I announced it to the class. They all looked at me, like she is really crazy this time. But I was telling them I wanted all of their thoughts, and my classes are largely full of white students and some immigrants on the side. Rarely is there a black kid doing Islamic studies. But I told them all of our past references to my black color, whether it was by me or them, were null and void. Well, students couldn't do it. They had no, conversations could not let me be purple. If I said, as a purple person, what I see is this, they were just, I can't do it. You're standing there and I'm looking at you. And I said, but can't you change your lens? No. One of the things was that color is so prevalent that all of us have a great deal of difficulty seeing past it, through it, over it, or even engaging it and going on. I have to admit, I would have had to have been white for them to see no color, no pun intended. White is not translucent. But when white professors are in front of them, they said they saw no color, did not think about color, even the immigrants among them. So that was very interesting for me. No matter what my credit score, I pay more. No matter my profession or resources, where I live in Chicago is ordained, so to speak. In the past, efforts here have been only partially successful, but I've found that it's individuals that change, and then perhaps they change institutions. Religious texts and reference to them, like the Quran, which explicitly states that God created difference, makes no difference. People who are bigots pass along the seeds of racism in many ways. And they will continue because there is a reward. It's a reward of a good job. It's a reward of good living. It's some reward. I think that for racism to stop, people have to have many more conversations like we're about to embark on today. And then racism has to have inevitable, unalterable penalties across the board. Thank you.